Lens to a discussion on the meaning of life. I'm Justin Lasser, an associate professor of religious studies at Manchester University.
And I'm KJ Kessie. I am an assistant professor of psychology, also at Manchester University.
And I'm Jonathan Krull, and I teach philosophy at Manchester and at Huntington and at St. Francis. And I also direct the honors program at Huntington, and I'm on the ethics review board for Parkview Health Systems.
Wow. The little things that we learn about you. Well, so this is going to be a discussion with mainly two questions. And the first is, how do we in our respective disciplines in our life approach the question of the meaning of life? So Jonathan, would you mind starting with that as a trained philosopher here?
Sure. Briefly, the typical philosophical approach is to take an idea and try to find the necessary and sufficient conditions for that idea to be true. So, for example, you're essentially looking for, to give a rather ridiculous example, the recipe. So if we're thinking of like a chocolate cake, the necessary pieces of a chocolate cake would be like chocolate. If you don't have chocolate, you don't have a chocolate cake. And then the sufficient would be like all of the ingredients necessary to make an actual particular recipe. So if we're thinking of a meaningful life, you could say, well, what has to be there in order for a life to be meaningful? And then secondly, what are all the pieces together such that when you have them, you know that person is living a meaningful life, right? So you're looking for the necessary and sufficient conditions. And we also will do a bit of conceptual analysis. When you get in the necessary pieces, we can ask like, well, what is that thing? How does it work? So recently, well, we're coming to that. That's just like a broad overview for what a typical philosophical approach is going to be, and then a little bit more specifically for the recent history. The history of philosophy over the past century has been one where it's treated the question with a little bit of contempt. The question of the meaning of life was like, it felt like a question in ethics, and there was a while there in the early 20th century where philosophers treated ethics as though it were a illegitimate child of philosophy, right? So it's something that is essentially really nothing more than a description of your feelings about the world. You don't like it when someone does something bad. And so when we're talking about the meaning of life, well, this is just about someone's feelings, and really, who cares about that? That's not really hardcore philosophical work. I'm glad to say that that spasm has ended, and we're treating ethics, God, meaning now with hopefully the respect that the ideas themselves deserve. And this means then that right now what you have is essentially like a pent-up explosion, where there's a mini cottage industry of a bunch of different philosophers doing work in all different kinds of directions, seeking after the meaning of life. So, and I might end up talking about a couple of those, but that's generally where we're at right now.
Thanks for sharing that. KJ, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I do. So I guess what occurs to me in psychology, we would probably thinking about this in terms of psychology used to be primarily concerned with how do you prevent suffering, or how do you avoid negative things? How do we lessen these experiences we find unpleasant? And I'm embarrassed to say I don't quite know when this movement became popular, but I think it's been about in the last 20 years. Positive psychology movement. What is it for a human to flourish? And that we actually have a scale of human flourishing. So we can ask somebody on a survey to respond to some items and say, this is an indicator of well-being, or maybe we could even say that it's meaning above and beyond the absence of negative feelings. So this positive psychology movement's kind of taken hold, and psychologists are thinking about what constitutes living in a way that makes people happy, confers some kind of um, meaningful experience for them beyond suffering from mental disease, beyond suffering from, the conditions of poverty or stress or fatigue or just, the troubles in our life. And instead of focusing only on how to avoid those or lessen them, we're kind of thinking about how can we how can we tap into and understand what a person's experience of meaning and well-being is like, not just um, when the bad isn't happening, but while it's happening, so that we can almost be flourishing and suffering at the same time. And so I guess that's maybe where the field is at answering that question, although it's not as precisely defined as the necessary and sufficient. Um, I guess
Mhm.
I guess that's how a psychologist would probably maybe very generally think about that. So that's what I got.
Yeah, I hear it, two different ways of approaching that, where, for lack of a better term, the psychological thing is similar to like diagnostic categories, almost like
Mhm.
there's a particular way one feels, and we can kind of segment those off. Whereas Jonathan, I'm hearing from you a much more a bit more of a holistic. Not to say that you can't
Oh,
be
no.
holistic,
Mhm.
kind of. And the first thing in terms of religious studies, I'm so heavily influenced by Plato and some of the great church fathers and mothers from Cappadocia that I can't help but think through them. And that is this fancy word telos, so that like
Mm.
you have to have the end of a life in view. And I think like some of the most important things for me is to talk to people that are preparing to die. And that is when I can think about the meaning of life. I want to start there. That if the end is like the beginning, in the traditional sense, those are the people we should listen to. And
Mhm.
I think I really appreciated KJ talking about the importance of suffering. And I know you'll probably say more about that, but or the importance of struggle, not suffering for suffering's sake, but something to strive for. So I think of it in terms of the goal, the end. There's a variety of causes, but that kind of final one. And I'm thankful. I didn't hear it from either of you, and I haven't heard lately that meaning is anything you make of it. And I think Jonathan, you touched on that, and that just strikes me as wrong. Um, so yeah, if you want to share that, Jonathan, other thoughts before we go to our other questions and
Yeah.
everyone to come back to.
So two things about that. First, yeah, the people who say that meaning is whatever you want to make it typically tie it to desire. Just so long as you desire it, that's all that matters. As long as you're getting what you desire, then you're living a meaningful life. And this is obviously stupid. Not to put too fine of a point on it. Because when they typically think of it, you'll notice that the descriptions are of people who are living a certain kind of life already. They never actually take it seriously and then dive into what you really see people do with it. So there are some people who really seem to enjoy the suffering of others. There are some who are entirely content to spend their lives pursuing things that are just truly not important. And that's, it sounds incredibly judgmental to say that, until you find out, like, by talking to people, what they really do spend their time on. And frequently you'll find people who have like, the philosophical literature on this is merciless. So there's one that talks about it as like, imagine someone who wants to collect the most miniature tea sets. And they have a plaque in their office that just says, he who dies with the most miniature tea sets wins. Right. And so then that person spends their entire life with it. And then, right, they're just delighted doing it. And that's what they obsess about. And that's what they spend 24/7 of their life doing. Okay. Um, and then they die. Did they win? And then we can go worse than that. We can go much worse than that into things where we might look at it and say, like, that looks like a psychological issue. You look like you've got a serious problem. And the philosophical literature, again, is utterly merciless. The one that I'm thinking of in particular was the euphemism is think about a grinning excrement eater. What do? They're just eating excrement and they love it. And you're like, what, you're doing that? Think of something utterly disgusting and horrifying. And they're just committed to it. And you're like, oh, why are, and they're just like, no, there's something here. There's, yeah, there's artwork like that where you look at the piece of art and you think, why did you do this? This is worthless. This is horrifying. And they spent their life doing it. I'm thinking of some in particular, and I'm going to not say their names because I don't want them to be famous. I don't want their work to be spread.
Well,
So
the only thing, Jonathan, is I'm a little upset. You know, I mean, what you're saying is that there's a variety of species that are not living meaningful lives now because they're eating excrement primarily.
Hey, have you heard of fecal transplants? It's a thing.
It is a thing, right? But that's not the end goal of their life. And right, for the beings, you could actually, that's a nice Aristotelian move. You can qualify this by saying, what is the kind of being and what is it enough to satisfy that particular being? Given the kind of being that we are, these kinds of things aren't enough for us. We need more than that to match who and what we are. And then point number two, yeah, if we talk about the meaning of life and we ignore suffering, it becomes the equivalent of like whistling past the graveyard, right? Is the old phrase. You just ignore the reality of human destruction around you. Look, any philosophy that does that is not one that's going to work in the world. There are perfectly fine philosophy of ethical systems out there for robots that would not function for human beings. So you need to take into account the human being, and this means wrestling with the problem of suffering. Yeah, so that's a large part of what I'm thinking about right now.
Yeah, that what you both said made me think of a couple things. One is that, in answering this question broadly, I mean, psychologists would be interested in what are all the predictors, that hold true for everyone that result in this shared definition that we can all operationalize as meaningful, and that those things do exist. There are things that predict meaning and things that don't, and that's borne out in empirical literature, not just not just philosophical, but you know what I'm saying. We can reason empirically in that route too. And then this question of suffering, I mean, I think about religious traditions, I mean, that embrace the idea of suffering as can be purifying, it can be enlightening. Basically, I just said this to Justin earlier today, the new truth I'm kind of grappling with that I always knew is that once you live long enough, you've either been really lucky or you just haven't suffered yet. And you realize that everybody around you is suffering, and you can still have pleasure and desire and happiness amidst that suffering, but that there's no way to, excise suffering from your life. And you have to kind of discover a way to, maybe increase the good moments and the good emotions, but that it doesn't mean you're losing, right? It doesn't mean you've lost the game if you're suffering. And that judgment that maybe we place on ourselves or others when we're suffering, like, man, I must have really screwed up because I'm in a lot of pain right now, or I made the wrong choice in the person I'm dating, or I made a bad choice academically, and I went down this path that I thought was going to be for me, and now it's not, and now I'm regretting these choices. It's not a reflection on, I mean, maybe you did make a bad choice, but to suffer doesn't mean you've lost the game. And I liked what you said about kind of meditating on death. I was listening to an interview with she's a sister, a Catholic sister, and it was some title that you wouldn't necessarily associate with nuns of the 21st century, but she has like social media is like her job. She's a sister that does social media, and she was talking about she has a skull on her desk, and she's found it to be like, I can't even think of the right word, but her what?
memento mori, a
Yes.
reminder of your own mortality.
Thank you, Justin. That's exactly the word, the term. And she leaves it there every day, and it informs lots of the decisions, as it should, in a day-to-day fleeting, moment to the next. Does what I'm doing serve what I want, in this winning sense of like, have I run the race I want to win, or I want to run at the end of the day at my death, if my death is tomorrow, or if it's in 40 years, well, what I'm doing right now, am I happy, satisfied with the direction I'm taking, the choices that I'm making? And kind of meandered around there, but I think suffering, to avoid that, to focus purely on the hedonistic pleasure, and the great religions don't brush that off, and that self-control is a part of that too.
I think there's, in terms of religious studies and religious traditions, that cultivating of virtue through suffering. So again, not suffering to suffer as such, but that the suffering is a way of pruning and purifying, or the cosmic vision that you will be like the tree that burns but is not consumed. That the whole world would be a light in this kind of divine fire that is both experienced as judgment and as glorification. In that sense, I think the idea in the Christian tradition of a living martyrdom, balanced with the Buddhist tradition of, yes, like the reality of life is suffering, and yet each find the way through suffering by letting it go, while acknowledging that you don't just get rid of it. Hence, there's the eightfold path, right? It's a way of life, there's no magic moment of enlightenment. I know a lot of people think that, right? But any Buddhist that's worth anything is be like, it's a path, and the way is the first kind of title for Christianity, and that way of life. And so I think not in the sense of just suffering, but to suffer for something, and that one is found. We find who we are in the way that we die. Just it's not a great advertisement for Christianity. You're not going to get many people coming to a mega church and come here and die, right? But really to learn how to die in the sense of offering one's life, balancing that with the kind of, we were speaking the other day that there's no fall in the Garden of Eden, but it's a fall towards grace, right? So this way in which Gregory of Nyssa, this 4th century great theologian, and his sister Macrina the Elder, that suffering is that fall is precisely to train us. And you're a parent, you would want your children to grow up, and there's something important about becoming like them, and our eyes are opened. And so I wanted to stress life as an offering and a living martyrdom. Not that you have to literally die, but you have to have something that's worth dying for. And hopefully it's not just family, because in the Jesus tradition, you're supposed to leave them, right? And one of the most fascinating revolutions the world has ever known in terms of meaning is an alternative society where people lived in monasteries together, holding all things in common. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing that we don't always think of when we think Christianity, just in my field that I study.
Well, before about martyrdom, like the two different versions, red versus white. Red, the martyrdom of blood; white, the martyrdom of, okay, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to channel all of my life until I die into this, a life of sacrifice for the purpose of this other good. But they also thought of the life itself as a good too. Right? This is
yeah.
Yeah.
And I appreciate the way that both of you in your own way have said that it's, a good life does not mean getting the bad things out, right? But rather, but as KJ was telling me before, not to associate with people that just ruin your life, but learning a way to engage with those people to the extent possible in compassion and in love, rather than I'm uncomfortable, I don't want to talk to that, that kind of, I don't know. You wanted to say something about that.
This idea that you can just, if you're living with toxic people, that you're doing it wrong, or that if you have relationships in your life that are difficult, that you're just supposed to kind of, cut them off. And I think there's a difference between setting boundaries, not engaging in ways that, promote your suffering in a way that isn't helpful for either party, but that engaging with difficult people and difficult scenarios is what you're going to do forever. And you just cutting those things off would be depriving yourself of the ability to grow from those experiences and to practice all of these virtues. And I will just echo what you said. In the Catholic tradition, think of any time we suffer, we can give it purpose. And even if the purpose is not clear to us in the moment, why do I have, why did I lose why did I lose my dad at a young age? Well, we might not come up with a satisfactory answer, but the suffering that I'm going to go through because of that, I can find a way to gain meaning from it because I've been denied certain things. And in that pursuit of happiness or joy that I'm trying to experience, the denial of time with my dad or these moments that I thought I would have, is kind of a purification and a chance to focus and practice virtue in other ways that wouldn't have come up without that. And I think of maybe either of you could talk about fasting, the form of fasting from food or going on just a water diet for several days at a time, and what the role of that has been historically, I think is really interesting when you talk about suffering. And that's kind of like a microcosm of human suffering in some ways.
My dream travel class with students is to take them to Egypt and put them in a cave and say, see you in 3 weeks. And I don't know if anyone will go, but but I mean, what I find most, daunting about that, scary, is the idea of perpetual silence. I mean, we don't have that place where we can be silent, and we'll put it in a mindfulness hour or 15 minutes or something like that. But weeks of a restricted diet or another form of to pray for someone that you don't like and to just think of them and picture them happy is what a powerful practice. And I never understood for a while the gift of tears. So that's what monks pray for, the gift of tears. And the greatest sin that people can't get out of the way is pride, right? And I remember that the reception of that gift of just being not, it didn't hurt. It was an acknowledgement of the suffering that I've caused and the mistakes. And I think being alone forces you to do that. And with all the apps that we have, guilty of that, we don't have time to be solitary. And I wish there's a movement about this, to not think of people as single but as solitary. Or solo would be, so that you're not missing something.
Yeah.
Well, Jonathan, I want to hear your thoughts on that, but I just want to highlight the next question because I know we have a time frame here. And the next question that you can also answer with this is this relationship between happiness and meaning. Is there one? What is that? How does that work in industrial organizational psychology? How does it work ethically? So we can do that, and we'll finish in 5 to 7 minutes if that works.
Sure. So the second question, when we're thinking of like the meaning of life, one common way to talk about, so as both KJ and Justin have mentioned, the idea of flourishing. And as I briefly alluded, Aristotle has this picture of certain powers that we possess, certain attributes that human beings have that when they are satisfied, then we are living the flourishing life. So he thinks of this as like, you need certain things. So most obviously like food and oxygen and water. But those are at a very low level for us. And in fact, for anyone who has, done almost any amount of study in psychology at all, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you look at that and you're like, well, he clearly read Aristotle. This is pretty clearly influenced. Oh, and by the way, the positive psychology movement that KJ mentioned earlier also is heavily influenced by Aristotelian thinking. A lot of people have been going back to Aristotle over the past century. Um, yeah, like the history of ethics, you didn't really talk about Aristotle for quite a while until about the 1960s or so, when a woman named Elizabeth Anscombe wrote an article criticizing modern moral philosophy for having this really serious gaping hole in it, um, and using words in ways that they weren't justified in using because it came from a Christian tradition and they had abandoned Christianity. And so now you're using the words without the tradition to back it up. That's weird. So what do? We need to have this picture of what a human being is for and how we function. So she actually insists that we need a philosophical psychology to have any concept of what human beings actually need and how we can actually function in the world. So as a result, virtue ethics is now a really hot area of practice. And that's part of what I'm going to draw in to answer a little bit of this question. When we think of like what it takes in order for a human being to be at rest, you could think of it that way, where your desperate, longing, searching is finally at a point where you're like, oh, that's it. In some ways, Aristotle answers that. In others, he's going to leave it, open. But in some of those ways, it would include friendship as near the highest good. And then on top of that, intellectual fulfillment, the pursuit of a practice where we are constantly perfecting, constantly growing, constantly developing. So you could think of it as like artistic pursuits, as someone is getting better and better and discovering more about something, like musical forms. Think of someone like Prince, who I'm from Minnesota, so we're very proud of our musical history. It sounds very strange to say Minnesota has one, but we've got Bob Dylan and Prince, and I defy every other state to match it.
Just had to drop that in there. I said, okay, fair enough. Yeah, I'm from New York, by the way. You know
Well, Indiana
yes.
tends to have Lincoln, but it's just his boyhood home. That's what it says on the sign.
Yeah, great. So when I think of like Prince, now they're talking about the vault of music that they're starting to open, and they realize that they think that they have something like 8,000 unreleased recordings by him, where he's just simply constantly creating. Well, imagine someone like that. What do they like doing? He's doing it. He's just constantly in the process of thinking this thing. So when you have like a community of family and friends, when you have interesting and deep work that you can pursue, when you have physical health inside of like a community, a broader community, a political community. For Aristotle, it would have been called the polis, where we get the city-state from. So Minneapolis, that Prince is in. When you have these things, then you've got the majority of what a human being needs. Now, later thinkers pointed out that there are some gaps in this. And where I'm going is focus on, first of all, yes, friendship, that's going to be part of it, but we seem to have like a longing at a very deep level for more than just simply the human community. So this longing for a kind of transcendence, a kind of personal relationship. If you remember the previous video, Justin and I talked about this, and Bob and Lou were there too, talking about an I-thou relationship instead of merely an I-it. It's not about merely the fulfillment of our desires. That's us looking at the world and basically treating it as a servant for our hungers, right? Instead, what is actually there, it puts us into a different relationship of one of a kind of like openness and respect for something more. Instead of treating everything as though it served me and I'm the God King of the universe, it's now me as in an open search. That's way healthier for a human being. We're not built for being that God King. So that's part of what I'm thinking about. And I've been thinking about this in particular with regards to suffering very recently through people who are in like really awful circumstances. the people at the extremes. And I can think of it in two separate ways. First, well, the way that Justin already mentioned with people who are dying, yeah, that's where pretension is stripped away. What do you really care about? There's not, just talk about that. You don't have time to do anything else. That's a great way to talk about awakening at that point. A second way would be to talk about people who are at the extremes of intellectual development on the very low end of the scale. So when I talk about a meaning of life, I'm always trying to figure out how does it impact severely developmentally disabled people. If I say meaning of life requires that you can do like music like Prince, I'm sorry, I just left out everybody else in humanity. So who am I leaving out by focusing on the kind of meaning that I'm looking at? I want it to be as basic to the human experience as possible. And in fact, Camus has this little phrase that is fantastic for this. He talks about, well, I think that they're going to read that article, but I'll mention a little bit of it right now. He talks about how consciousness inaugurates everything for us to be aware, right? So, and the nice part about that, what I really like is you can talk to people who are severe, who are even like nonverbal. They can't talk back to you. They don't have the ability, but there's an awareness there and you can see it. So even at the extreme low end of the scale, if consciousness is tied to meaning, if awareness is tied to meaning, then they can have it too. So I want to protect that and then think about what that means and how that works. And then lastly, people going through open hell. So my mom was a special needs teacher. And this meant that every so often she would have really serious nightmares, because when you teach K-5, kindergarten to 5th grade, and you have to call in police officers to handle a 6-year-old girl, because, right, and 4 adult male police officers to handle 1 6-year-old girl because she's losing her mind. They put her into the back of a car and she literally tears apart the police seats with her bare hands. She's ripping them to pieces because of how much rage she has in her body, because of the severe sexual and mental and physical abuse that her parent put her through, her mother. I think of someone like that. And it turns out that when you talk about people like that, the vulnerable, the ones who go missing in America, the ones who go and are being trafficked, it's people like that who don't have someone that loves them. The people that took care of them betrayed them at every step of the way in the most basic ways possible. So these kids are the ones who are ultra vulnerable. When they run away from home, nobody's looking. When they show up at the bus stations, something like 41% of runaway kids at bus stations are approached the first night for sexual favors. The first night. Hey, I got a place for you to stay. You just need to do something for me. Well, I think about kids like that. Why are they so vulnerable? You'd think that all of that damage would turn them off. But what it reveals is a longing to have anyone care in any way for them. This is a deep human need. So I look at this and I see like the level of suffering that we cause to ourselves and to other people, and think like, man, this is just utterly brutal. The gift of tears that Justin mentioned, this is something that that monks talk about in terms of like grieving over one's own serious issues, one's own flaws and faults, to find them, to know them, and to get rid of them, through grieving them out.
And to cry for others.
And to cry for others. And to cry for others. And tears in this case are the appropriate, I think, response. So you get this picture of a world where we've got these possibilities, Aristotle talks about it when things are going right, and that's great. We do need to know that. But how do we get people out of these places in order to bring them to something more? How do we bring, right? That's the question of redemption. So when I think of this, I think of like in a very strange way. This is Kierkegaard's approach. I've mentioned him before, and there's these weird requirements on us. You might think that like, okay, what should we do for these people who are in the most vulnerable positions? I know, we'll just go and weep and hold them. Well, there's actually, and that's part of it, but there's actually something that's also helpful, and that is a kind of strange demand that they recognize that they are a being of worth. So this is true of you. You are not nothing. You are not worthless. So the ones who have entered into what they call the life of sexual trafficking, many of them are entering into it of their own, let's put air quotes around this, free will, after being betrayed like this. That's no longer really free will, right?
No.
So when we think of people who are like that, to remind them, no, you are not actually worthless. This clearly has to be a basis of human meaning, the worth of the human individual. So I think of this as reminding them of possibilities that they might never have even considered, that those possibilities are real. You don't have to be trapped in this. There's a crack. There's a crack in the wall. Light can get there. Secondly, right, hopefully they can see like through, and I've talked to, I'm thinking of an organization in Chicago that actually, they call themselves Emmaus. They walk with people through this. Their goal is to walk with them in it, even if they are in the life, even if they don't think of themselves as worth it, just to be there and to care for them. And then ultimately to convince them to leave, right? But just accepting them where they're at to begin with. And part of this then entails like, listen, this is real. I want you to start to believe it. How then do you turn to start acting towards that belief? So that is also a requirement. They have to want it. So the pictures that I'm giving you here are actually a combination of three ancient virtues. The ancient theological virtues of hope, of faith, and then ultimately of love. Hope, to believe that there is a possibility there beyond what you have seen. Faith, to act in such a way to aim at it. You are really lining up, oh, this might be possible for me, and then starting to do something towards it. And then the way that Kierkegaard talks about it, all of it is undergirded by love. Love is the thing that perfects these other two virtues. Love automatically hopes for the person that you love. So if you love someone, if you don't hope for them, that's not love. You have hope. You want them to develop. You believe that they can. Secondly, if you love someone, then you are going to act in such a way as to increase them, right? This is maintaining faith for them, how to build them up. Well, in a way, this is also how you build yourself up. Fascinating. So love automatically does these things. I've talked for way too long. I'm sorry.
I'm so fascinated,
Okay.
Jonathan. I'm loving it.
Okay, very good. All right, so just to finish, well, I'm always trying to keep in mind the people who are at the absolute limits. How do we protect them? Principle. So yes, that's right. Secondly, then, what is it that is going to actually bring them out of this? So what are the necessary features for the recipe? And yeah, those are three. I can't imagine anyone living a good human life without them. Like if you don't have hope in your life, I'm sorry, that's a very bad life. If you don't have some way, and then faith, sometimes people react to that because they think that it's I don't know how to put this, merely religious, as though it were. It's not. It's, I mean, it is, right? It's coming from that language. It is that, but to understand it as an actual living commitment. This is really what you're doing. And then lastly, with love, yes. I think for my money, one of the most beautiful books of the last, say, 1,000 years is Kierkegaard's Works of Love. And it is just simply astonishingly powerful. This is someone who is a absolute master of philosophical concepts, writing probably, well, I've mentioned this before, I think he's one of the 3 best philosophical writers of all time. And he's clearly operating at the height of his powers with this book. It is just astonishing. And so in it, he's talking about, like, these are a few of the different things that love can do. And it's inexhaustible and it's infinite, and it will always unfold as a part of, well, that Aristotelian practice that we can enter into. It is a never-ending practice that you can enter into. So that's when so happiness then, to finish with the question. Yeah, every time I talk about happiness, I always want to go through talk about the people of the limits first. Because anytime we talk about the happy life, we typically talk about perfection and forget about, like, how you get there. How do we actually get there? How do we bring these people there? It's not like happiness is bad. It's just our understanding of it is limited. So when KJ talks about suffering and being, right, pursuing enjoyment at the same time, right, that's the ballgame. Like, that's definitely the project. So how do you use suffering? How do you convince people who have suffered unjustly, absolutely unjustly, that they can turn, that they can use that it can become something more than just the thing that happened to them? It doesn't, I mean, everybody says this, but it's true. It doesn't have to define them. So the picture of, like, flourishing, how is it that you can encourage even the most damaged to aim at that, to make it as gentle and also as rigorous as possible? This is what we aim at the same time, and yet it be the most gentle.
Well, I'm gonna, yeah,
Can I,
I would like to hear KJ's thoughts on
Well,
this too. Thank you,
Jonathan, this is why I love being at a liberal arts institution. I mean, you said so many things that was just this very beautiful tying together of different schools of thought that I've been a student of. I mean, of my own experiences in life. I mean, nothing horrific has happened to me. That's not what I mean by that. But this idea that these virtues are very transcendent. You know, Aristotle is as relevant today. You know, this idea that we come up with new virtues that serve us now. I mean, so much of the language of what you're talking about, it's just echoed in so many places, and in secular places and in religious places, and we're all converging on, you know, so many similar threads, that I just found that to be so beautiful. And I guess one different direction I can take or spin off, when I love that you brought up talking about the people that are at those fringe places, because it does seem so self-serving when we talk about flourishing sometimes. Like, well, we're kind of assuming that all our basic needs are met, and so it's for the people that are already doing okay. Like, how do they flourish? And there's this some, like, footnote, like, well, you know, rules and exclusions apply. Like, not everybody's at the starting point. And I think of, as an IO psychologist, what does an organization owe the people that work for it, in terms of giving them that meaning? And do they owe it to them, and to what cost do they owe it? And I think that there's some really simple but powerful truths that, you know, organizational psychologists have empirically distilled, that are not brand new information. You know, as I'm listening to you talk about this, I'm like, well, this isn't new. I mean, this exists in a meta-analysis, you know, study of studies. And they've said absolutely these things confer meaning to the worker. But what I'm reminded of with what you're saying is, we've known this for a very long time. And the employer, I think, once enlightened, has great responsibility to do what's possible to give people that meaning in their jobs. And if they are going to suffer in some way in their job, there are still ways that, despite that suffering, that an employer can make the job meaningful. And it's I think the theory, couple that relate to this. One's called the job characteristics model. Talks about kind of five factors that we can adjust in any given job. Some have more of certain things than others, but I'll just give you a few. One of them is autonomy, control. The more control we can give people, generally, the more meaningful they find whatever it is they're doing. And some jobs are really inherently controlled by uh, a set of operating procedures. You can't deviate during air traffic control, or you fly the plane the same way every time, or you have to do the same medical procedure the same way because it's the safest way. But we can find ways to give people control. That you might just have to get creative, where they park their car, when they pick their schedule, what they wear to work, where they get to eat for lunch, how many days a month they have to do X, Y, Z, when they get to complete the training. And those things show people that they have dignity and worth. And I think it gets at that idea that even in a crappy job, you can still give people dignity. And another part of this job characteristics model is task identity. People seeing that end result of the product that they're making. They're not just, turning the wrench on this particular wheel. They get to see the car roll out of the factory, and they get to see, like, yeah, I did something, and I get some satisfaction in knowing that I was a part of this. I might be a cog in the wheel, literally, figuratively, but it's in this grand thing that's happening. And the employer has a way to show the employee that they don't have to keep them in a square box where they're just turning that wrench. They can give them opportunities to see this end product. And then I talk about one more task. What's the other one I said? Task identity, task significance. Well, shoot. The other is skill variety, like being able to do different things, allowing people to grow, and for some people, they don't want to grow in big intellectual ways, but maybe they would like to learn how to use a different kind of furniture polish than the one that they're currently using. And those small opportunities to do something different, or to do something in a new way, to learn a new skill, that can give dignity and meaning to a person in a way that makes their life more meaningful. And I do think having this conversation's made me think more about, this positive psychology movement, the responsibility that organizations bear when it comes to designing jobs. And then, the last piece I'll say is that there's this new thing in this discovered, or put a name to it, it's been around forever. This idea of job crafting came out, I think, about 10 years ago. They did this study with people who provided custodial services in hospitals. And they divided the group of people into the people that were happy with their jobs and the people that were dissatisfied. And they asked those people, all with the same job title, what is it you do for the hospital? The people described profoundly different jobs. And the people that were happy had crafted their job and added responsibilities or traded out other ones to maximize the value in their job. So they escorted patients out of the hospital, even though that wasn't a part of their job. And they viewed themselves as helping the patient to rehabilitate instead of just cleaning the room. And it was, the employer didn't create this environment for them to craft the job. These were just the types of people that chose to craft the job that way. But it made such a difference for them in how they viewed themselves and how they viewed their work. There's some other really interesting studies on that, but this idea of job crafting, that once you give people this reminder that they have dignity and worth, and that they have some agency, and not that it's up to them, it's not, this is a crappy job, but they're job crafting, so figure it out, kind of thing. I think I tried to talk to students a lot about job crafting, and this idea that someday they're going to manage people, and it's going to be their job to ensure that that person is as fulfilled and as healthy in that subordinate role as can be, because they have more power and authority than they might have previously thought. So I kind of went a different route.
Yeah,
on that.
no, thank you for that. Yeah, that's both of you.
Really cool.
I had my initial response of just reflecting on the division of labor. That is, for those listening, is, when you divide up a company with certain tasks, you will make burgers, you will put the sauce on, you will take the customer's payment. And I think that is one of the most noxious things that happen, and unethical things that happen. And we have productivity out of it. But if you look at the 1920s, those factory conditions to today, and sometimes in this country, but in places like Bangladesh, where, even the buildings are crumbling, are the way that we think of the human being in our ideology has made us open to that, to think that somehow productivity is more important than flourishing. And, I love the idea that positions can have a variety of features that you can extend towards, right? So that you can embrace other parts of what it means to be human at this particular organization. And then the other thing I wanted to say was just that I find myself between psychoanalysis, commitment there, clinically, not ethically, like in the sense of what happens in the clinic, what you hear, and my religious intuitions that are really attentive to that I vow, that the mystery of existence is utterly fortuitous, that it's not that the world is, but that the world sustains and remains reflective of the human mind, and vice versa. And so I wanted to recover, in terms of my religious tradition, that the Greek notion of the nous, this intellectual intuition, but they also refer to it at the heart. And in those moments when someone walks in the room and your heart drops, or like, that is what they understood by knowing, because you have to participate in the knowing. You can't just do 1 + 1 = 2. What is the one unless you're participating in? So that's that transcendental, beyond the world, that summons us, which is why I don't think of meaning just as what you make it, but you respond to it within this situation, right? And the idea of, there are people that are present in this country but not included, not represented. And this is a famous philosopher, Alain Badiou, and our task is, in any situation, to make those who are present represented, right, in the system, whether that is the person that is the lowest of the lowest that you were talking about, bring up. And in the Christian tradition, we must identify with the victim, right? And that I just find it, so that here comes the psychoanalysis part, is that most people don't believe what they believe. They think they do. And I think we should be, in terms of a meaningful life and happiness, many of my beliefs are defense against experience. So that, I can go to church on a Sunday and I leave and I feel like I'm generally a good person. I think that's what we enjoy. Many people that get that, because it's not like they're reading the Bible, and if they are, then they're reading it in a very, very strange context, right? Literate world and all these things. And I think if you can't, so many of my Christian sisters and brothers can see the face of God in an unborn child, but not in the Mexican child that is born across a wall, right? Like, and they can't see that. And how in the world could you think that one is Christian? You have to identify with the victim, and to identify with, or kind of famous tradition of Matthew 25, to see in the hungry, the lame, those who are suffering from mental illness, to those who are abused as children and as adults, and so on. So all those things, and so the happiness piece comes up psychoanalytically, is that we find happiness quite boring, and it's not fulfilling, and yet I'm just very suspicious of my conscious wants versus what I am actually desiring. And oftentimes that those things that we complain about, after many years of psychoanalysis, going through it myself, it's precisely something you don't want to give up. And that I think we need to be attentive to. And sign of a good life is one that doesn't speak in negations, that we start to take responsibility for what we say. So when I say something like, I wouldn't say I hate her, but, right,
Heart
that,
or heart.
yeah, exactly. Those are different ways that we don't speak, fully, not even truthfully, but fully, so that and so I just wanted to raise that as something to be attentive to, divided between intuitive knowing, participating, and also acknowledging that my unconscious is not some deep thing, but really just on the surface, the stuff I don't want to tell myself that I do.
Mhm. This is deep, guys.
This is deep. Well, Jonathan, did you want to say one last thing, and then
Sure.
KJ, and then we'll finish up, and I'm done speaking. So
You
Uh,
are.
Sure. Yeah, this has been great. Really love the idea of job crafting. The the idea, and yeah, like both of you talk about this, like this transcendent. It's not meaning of our merely of our own creation, but there is our creation involved in it. We
Mhm.
take on this thing. Yes, this is what I've been given, and then we do something with it. Yeah, that's really cool. Uh, that obviously includes like notions of autonomy in it inherently, and then like this picture of doing something, adding my own being to it. This is who I am. This is what I want with it, right? So I'm taking on the task given to me, but now I'm going to make it my own. I'm participating. You get a sense of like the workers in the hospital who do that would be, or really any organization. Um, the level of happiness, I'm really not surprised that they're happy. That just sounds like doing something that you're happy doing. Uh, yeah, the previous head of the ethics review board at Parkview was this like dynamic force of nature. She's moved on to another challenge. She's basically like a serial entrepreneur. She can't hold herself back from something hard to do. And she had taken the job, and for a while she had the chaplains of the hospital parking patients' cars for them. Like, and the
great.
only question she asked was, what more can we do to serve the patient? We're going to go into every different thing and make it our own, and then provide a service for them. And identifying themselves with the weak and the sick. Yeah, it was great. So I was like, man, I am definitely this is definitely the right place. These people are definitely doing what I love to see. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And then also like yeah, the concept of like relating then to this transcendent, relating to God. What does it mean for this being, right, for us to talk about in terms of meaning? Can you live a meaningful life without it? Right? There's a lot of atheists out there. Are they living a meaningless life if they don't believe in God? And then for the ones who do, how does that relationship make your life meaningful? Because too many people think of it as puppet control. But if you think of it along the lines of something like the job crafting, where you're taking this, you're like, okay, well, this is the task. Now, how do I do it with the will? How do I make it? Right? There's something there, but that's really cool. So yeah, no, and that's something we can explore, I think, in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, the last two thoughts I had is any of these kind of strategies we've talked about, at least maybe the ones that I'm thinking of, people will push back, in one way and say, well, it's a crappy job, but I'm going to give you job crafting so anybody can make a bad job good. And I think there's always the line to be walked there. These are tools, right? And these are ways of existing in the world. And really, it should be an empowerment. It shouldn't be a substitute for poor conditions. And then the other, when you're talking about, you know, horrible conditions of the industrial era, and we made work really efficient, but at what cost did we do that? And I think you'd get people to push back and say, well, yeah, but what did capitalism give us, and what did efficiency and meat production give us? And now we're feeding all these people that we weren't feeding before. There'd always be an argument against like making work less efficient or going back to this one person, the craftsman model of doing. But I don't think it has to be this or that. And there are ways to, keep labor divided, but allow for some task integration or allow for humanness to emerge, and allow for the way we talk about workers, and then we talk about the people who do the lowest or the lowliest of jobs, in just the language we use in our manuals, and in our daily communication, that even that would be a step in changing how we think of them, and what that means to do that kind of job. So that's all I wanted to add.
Well, thank you. And I'll, just to finish by saying that what I learn is the ethics of listening to both of you, and what that to mean authentically. We came into this conversation without a game plan, and it shows that if we trust that kind of free association with absolute empathy and positive regard, we can actually learn a lot. And yeah, I'm absolutely wowed. So
As the kids say, same.
I don't know what that is, but I will tweet it. #same.
Oh, that was good.
I think that's the end. Let's
Okay.
hashtag what?
Yeah, #same.
All right.
Okay.
Good to see you all.
Thanks so much.